With new tariffs announced for Canada, Mexico and China, could Europe be next? We'll discuss the latest threats from US President Donald Trump and how European leaders are responding. Hello, I'm Armin Steinbach, and this is The Heat. The European Union is bracing for a possible trade war with the United States. On Sunday, US President Donald Trump called the trade relationship an atrocity, complaining that the EU exports far more to the United States than it imports. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Europe's best approach is to remain level-headed.
I want to be clear. Europe will safeguard its economic and national security. But it is important that we strike the right balance. One that places emphasis on the positive tools of economic statecraft, such as trade, investment, innovation and production. We want to avoid a global race to the bottom that is in no one's interest. That has to be our primary focus, even as we prepare for all possible scenarios.
For more on the European Union's response and the economic outlook for 2025, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Halle in Germany is Oliver Holtemoller. He is the Vice President of the Halle Institute for Economic Research. Also with us from Paris, Armin Steinbach is a professor of EU law and economics with the business school HEC Paris. From London, Klisman Murati is the founder of Pareto Economics and creator of the Global Power Index. And Philippe Legrain is a former economic advisor to the President of the European Commission and visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics European Institute. He joins us from London. Hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us. Philippe, let's begin with this threat from US President Donald Trump to slap tariffs on Europe. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
It will definitely happen with the European Union, I can tell you that, because they've really taken advantage of us. And you know, we have over a $300 billion deficit. They don't take our cars, they don't take our farm products, they take almost nothing. And we take everything from them, millions of cars, tremendous amounts of food and farm products.
So, Philip, the president was exaggerating the numbers there. In 2022, the deficit was over $132 billion, not $300 billion, as he said. But still, officials are taking this very seriously. What are we looking at here? What are the options that Europe have? Could we see a trade war?
I think a trade war is likely. The self-declared tariff man seems to want to act big on the global stage, and he likes building a tariff stick, and he's threatened to do so against the European Union, and I imagine that he will follow through. That said, the EU needs to do everything in its power to try to avoid a trade war, which would be harmful to both sides, and there are obvious things that it could do, like promising to buy more American liquid natural gas, which the Trump administration is keen to export, or buying more defense equipment, which it needs to do as it rearms given the war in Ukraine. That said, I think Trump is itching for a fight, and the EU needs to be prepared to retaliate if he does start a trade war. The danger, of course, is that the EU has more to lose than the US does. It has a surplus, and therefore it exports more to the US than vice versa. It has a fragile economy, and anything that depresses growth, pushes up prices, and creates uncertainty and instability is going to be bad for the economy.
Oliver, let's talk about Germany. It was the largest exporter to the United States in 2023, according to figures released by Eurostat. The German automaker Volkswagen now has 2 plants in Mexico. How would this impact Germany's economy if Trump goes ahead, follows through with that threat to impose tariffs?
Trade conflict will affect the German economy via several channels. First, there's the direct channel. I mean, if there are tariffs to Germany or the European Union or via Mexico, then this will affect firms which are exporting goods to North America. But there will be also an indirect channel, which is very important for Germany, a global trade conflict will also have consequences for global demand, for the economic development in the entire world. And since Germany is an open export-oriented country, also via these indirect channels, the German economy will be negatively affected.
That's right. In fact, President Trump, as we mentioned earlier, has also imposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China as well. So this could affect the global economy as well. Armin Steinbach, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, he is looking at this in a bit of an optimistic way. He's sort of adopted the glass half full scenario. He says these actions by the United States should drive Europe to be stronger and to be more united. Let's listen to what he had to say.
It's simple. We think the priority is this strategic agenda and the security of our borders. If we're attacked on trade topics as a power that holds, Europe has to make itself respected and react.
So, Armin, Macron may want respect, but if we look at Eurozone growth, it's expected to reach 1.1% this year. I mean, how much negotiating room does Europe really have? I mean, there was an analysis which was put out by Deutsche Bank which says that a 10% flat tariff could wipe out half of 1% to just under 1% of GDP in Europe. I mean, how significant are the risks for the EU?
I think they are definitely significant. We should not forget that Europe, and especially the big European countries, Germany and France, are in a vulnerable situation. Economic growth is slow. The exports are not as they should be, and being hit in such a situation by tariffs would be disastrous. And we should also not forget that this has happened before. Trump had imposed tariffs 2017, and back then it was also the French wine industry, you may remember, that was hit by 600 million damage through these tariffs. So there is a problem. What is certainly true, what Macron just said, is that the EU has to learn to stand on its own feet, right? Strategic autonomy, that's the slogan, the political slogan of the hour. The EU has to learn to speak with one voice in order to be strong to oppose these tariffs.
Armin, Macron also tried took some preemptive steps to try and pacify Trump, and he invited Trump after the election, before he was inaugurated, to the reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. But it doesn't seem like this charm offensive on the part of the French president has worked. So what are the alternatives?
I mean, the alternatives are certainly to try to play soft power. Soft power is what the European Union has done in the past, and soft power implies too that the EU looks for alternatives, for alternative trading partners, for alternative trading agreements with other blocs, other economically relevant blocs. And the first bloc that is relevant for the EU at the moment is Mercosur, it's Latin America. The EU is at the stage of concluding an agreement that would open a huge market for the European economy. But there we see that even though everybody talks about we should speak with one voice in Europe, at the end each country pursues its own individual interest. Mm-hmm. France is opposing Mercosur in order to protect its agricultural interest. So at the end the interests in the European Union are heterogeneous, and that is an obstacle to come up with a unionized position.
Okay, let's bring Klisman Murati into this conversation. Klisman, during Trump's first term, the EU was one of the first US trade partners to be slapped with tariffs. That was a 10% tariff on aluminium exports and a 25% tariff on steel. The EU responded at the time with tariffs on various US products, including bourbon, blue jeans, and motorcycles. How do you see a potential trade war playing out this time?
It's very American things for the EU to tax from the Americans, I suppose. Look, the EU is really stuck in a position where they have no real growth drivers that can drive macroeconomic growth in the Union. AI tends to be something that people think about as being activated, but due to the size of the EU and the regulations and the regulatory capture, I suppose you say, of the EU, we don't see much happening in terms of that. So the EU really have to understand what will drive the economy over the foreseeable future. How can we raise the skill level of the EU? How can we, if we do have migration, what kind of migrants do we need? What kind of skills do they have? And what vision do we really have for the Union in the foreseeable future. Once that's established, then any multilateral engagement with any partner, be it the US, China, or whomever, is going to be much easier to lay out because you know where you want to, you know what you want to achieve and where you want to go. Trump, for example, is very hawkish on the EU. I suppose for right and wrong reasons. When they talk about agriculture, the EU standards for food are very different to the US's, which is why we see a curtailing of trade of agriculture from the US to the EU, manufacturing from Germany into America through car sales is something which is obvious that's happening. But the EU really need to understand what position they want to play in the world and how they want to engage with President Trump, at least in the short run, for the next 4 years. And once that's established, hopefully they have a better future in the long run.
Right. And Klisman, if we have to broaden out the impact of what Trump is considering for the rest of the world, Oliver talked about this a moment ago, tariffs will result in prices going up and possibly in demand going down. How will this affect the global economy?
Not good, of course. I mean, once you put trade barriers in, reintroduce trade barriers in the world, then naturally what we're going to have is an inflation of cost. The world has spent a long time trying to reduce trade barriers through the WTO and its past incarnations. Now, this is because they had a vision of the world where you have less trade barriers, you have more trade, and you have more prosperity for the world. That has played out on the Pareto curve, where few countries win out big time, and those who are on the tail end don't win out at all. Also, what Trump wants to do is reverse the trade deficit that it has with the world. Some may argue that that's what has kept the US in prime position. That's why the US dollar is so strong. So if you want to reverse this, which is going to take a long time and a lot of pain for the global economy, you really need to make sure that this is the right decision for the country as a whole for the long run. Now, we haven't seen any, of Trump's thoughts as to what the future will be for the US if this is reversed. But for sure, in the short time at least, this is going to mean a lot of pain, especially if these tariffs come tit for tat with other countries also imposing tariffs as a result.
Philippe, no doubt Europe's best minds are coming together to decide on a formula, a policy on how to respond to these threats from Donald Trump. In a commentary piece you wrote that was published online by Project Syndicate, you floated the idea of the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. You say she might be the ideal candidate to lead negotiations with Trump. What's your thinking behind that?
Well, Giorgia Meloni is very popular in the MAGA circles in Washington, and she therefore would seem to me the ideal advocate if the EU was trying to secure peaceful trade relations and broader relations with Donald Trump. Obviously, if Trump has already started a trade war, her scope for acting will be limited. But someone who shares the conservative social values, someone who's seen as being, ideologically aligned, and obviously someone who is physically attractive, something that Donald Trump responds to, will be potentially a more persuasive intermediary than the French president or indeed the German chancellor, with which there'll be status competition and who won't have the same ideological connections.
And Philippe, just before I move on, what are your thoughts on the possible impact this kind of potential trade war could have on the global economy? I'm thinking especially of developing countries and what that would mean to them.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've already seen a tariff slapped on China. There's the threat of tariffs on Canada and Mexico. There's a threat of tariffs with the EU, which rely on dollar funding for businesses that rely on dollar funding, and which find that their markets are depressed and their borrowing costs are higher. So it could actually be extremely damaging for the rest of the world.
Oliver, Germany recently slashed its growth outlook for 2025 from 1.1% to 0.3%. And looking at what's going on in Germany politically, the country will hold an early parliamentary election, February 23rd. That's after the Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition collapsed in November in a dispute on revitalizing the economy. What went wrong for Germany? What does it need to do? Is it just about energy costs?
No, it's not only about energy costs. Germany is facing three major structural challenges. The first is the demographic change that we have in Germany. So the population is aging and shrinking, and that leads to shortages in labor supply. And this is, difficult for firms to invest if you have not the labor supply available that is necessary to work in the future. So demographic change is one major structural threat. Then the second one is the energy transition, which turned out to be a major threat in particular for the German car industry, which is very important also for productivity growth in Germany. It was at least the major driver of productivity growth in the past. And the third major threat or challenge is the economic transition in China, the structural change that is going on in China. China is replacing some of the traditional German manufacturing exporters in large parts of the world. And this is something to which German business have to react.
Armin, France's economy is also facing headwinds. Fourth quarter figures show the economy shrunk by 0.1% in the fourth quarter, as I said. What is the outlook for the rest of the year?
Well, the biggest burden on the French economy remains the political instability. We had the snap election last year, and that President Macron called without this being a necessary move. And ever since, there has been a minority government in place, a very unstable government. Literally today, the government won some breathing space because today the government budget for 2025 was finally approved after 6 months of struggling, and this is a way forward because now the government can invest and can pay the bills. However, two main sources of political instability keep on weighing on the economy. The first is the fiscal situation. France sits on a massive amount of debts, 115% of GDP, and runs a 6% budget deficit. It has to bring this down to 3% by 2029. So what we will see over the next years is a fiscal consolidation path. In fact, for the next year, France wants to cut expenditure 30 billion and raise taxes by 20 billion. So we are really seeing the demand will shrink, and therefore also the economy overall losing steam. This is one source of risk. And the second one is that the political instability is affecting the business and the investment environment. If you see the surveys that indicate a decline in consumer and business confidence, it is all due to this lack of political stability. And if markets have reacted already nervously, France has been downgraded by a rating agency 2 times in the last year. So this is not an environment for business to invest.
So how much stability can we expect to see, Armin, now that the budget has been passed? As you pointed out, it will mean the government can pay its bills. It can also start investments. So what can we expect?
Well, first of all, we have to face that there will be tax increases. There will be an exceptional levy on companies with an annual revenue over 1 billion. There will be an additional income tax for wealthy people. We will see massive expenditure cuts. And we will see, and that is a threat also for the economy, a renegotiation of the pension reform. The pension reform was one of Macron's major structural reforms that he pushed through. And as a compromise in this environment of political instability, the new government had to offer to renegotiate this pension reform. So this is something, a Pandora box that is going to be opened, and as said before, not an environment for business to strive.
Klisman, the Bank of England cut interest rates again on Thursday with a weaker economic growth outlook. It cut interest rates by a quarter point to 4.5%. This is the third time in 6 months the central bank has taken this kind of action. So what is the outlook now?
Well, cutting the interest rate only spurs business if business has confidence in the growth potential of that country. Unfortunately for the UK, as we saw on the last recorded quarter growth numbers, the UK economy grew at 0%. This is obviously not good. Now, to change this, the government needs to think to themselves, what can we do to stimulate growth in the economy for small and medium-sized enterprises, for entrepreneurs, and also for the blue chips? Now, they have come out with their growth plan, which has been met with, dismal responses by big businesses and also small businesses. So I think on the government policy side, they're not doing what they can to spur business growth. So having low interest rates may be good for home buyers because now they can buy a house cheaper over the long run. But that doesn't really incentivize businesses to start the business because they need to see potential in that economy for the long run. And they need to see themselves in a hospitable place for businesses to thrive and to grow. Government policy hasn't been aligned with that, I don't think, over the last 15 years, to be honest. And the Labour government aren't doing themselves a favour with this new growth plan that they put into place. So I don't really see much change in the UK economy over the next foreseeable future, especially if we have rising geopolitical risk across the world with the actions of the United States and others. Having ramifications on the UK economy, it won't be a good picture, I think, over the medium-term outlook.
Klisman, it's been 5 years since Brexit, when the United Kingdom left the European Union. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he met with the EU leaders this week in Brussels. He described the trip as a reset between the UK and the European Union, and this is some of what he said.
I've been very clear since I became Prime Minister that I do want a reset of the relationship between the UK and the EU. That does not involve a return to the European Union. We had a referendum here on that, and that matter is settled. But I do want to see a close relationship on defence and security, on energy, on trade and our economy, and that is what we're working on.
So, Klisman, the Prime Minister is saying that his major concerns in the relationship with Europe is defence, security, trade, as well as investment. What is he looking for?
Well, you tell me what's his plan. That's what he didn't. That's what he failed to mention in that statement. You know, it's so good to see we want a good relationship, but how do you do that? How do you get the ball rolling? I'll bring you back, Anand, to what Boris Johnson said when he declared Brexit a victory. He said this will be the era of global Britain. Do we remember that? Global Britain. Now, what have we seen since then? We've seen a degradation in the GDP of the world. We've seen heightened geopolitical risk. And we've seen a Britain which hasn't really done much to fulfill that title of global Britain. So Keir Starmer then comes into the picture and says he wants closer relations with the EU. Okay, that's fantastic. So what do you do about it? How do you align yourself with the EU? And what if that alignment with the EU goes counter to your alignment with the United States? Because there seems to be a rift in the middle, with the UK geographically and ideologically, I suppose, being right in the middle. So this is a very tense time, I think, for the UK. President Trump is coming in hot with his tariffs. The EU is trying to respond in a measured way, as they say. So the UK needs to decide what it wants for itself and actually put out plans and be bold in their assessments and in their actions to make it happen.
Philippe, Europe is still grappling with the energy crisis. That's 3 years after Russia invaded Ukraine. Europe has found new sources of energy. When we look at its imports of liquefied natural gas from the United States, for instance, but it is still buying Russian energy through middlemen at inflated prices. And according to the Financial Times, EU country imports from Russia, led by France, Spain, the Netherlands and Belgium, reached an all-time high last year in 2024. So what are the longer-term solutions for Europe?
Well, I mean, I think it's scandalous that 3 years into the war in Ukraine, that Europe is still importing energy from Russia, given that it is energy that funds Russia's war effort. And if now, basically now or never is a great time to be accelerating the move towards clean energy in Europe, as well as in the short term, diversifying energy sources, buying more LNG from the Middle East, but also from the US, which would help with Donald Trump, and accelerating other forms of investment to try and decarbonize the economy and reduce energy use. I think, I mean, the bigger picture is that Europe needs an investment strategy. Europe has been overly reliant on exports. It has profited massively from an era of globalization, and that era of globalization is under threat. And instead of desperately trying to cling on to a world that is disappearing, it needs to rely more on domestic growth, and that means relying more on investment, both public and private. It means trying to do more in the industries of the future, like AI and technology, where the EU has been primarily a regulator and not actually a producer, and indeed the pressing need of defence. And if ever there's a time to borrow and invest, it's in defence. And that is not just important in security terms, it also would provide an economic and employment boost.
Oliver, what is the energy outlook for Germany? Philippe mentioned a moment ago that this should stimulate a move towards, or encourage a move towards cleaner, green energy. Are you seeing something like that in Germany?
This progress in Germany is slow, so this will be a serious problem for the next years to come. This is also one reason why the German coalition failed in the end, because there is no reliable plan for the green transition. How can we manage to have manufacturing industry in Germany and bring the green energy transition to a success? This is completely unclear in Germany, maybe not only in Germany, but also in other parts of Europe. So there is no clear answer to your question. This is an open question. I would suggest that it's important to continue the success story that we have in Europe with the emission trading system. That was really a success. It will be expanded next year, and I expect it to have positive effects also in the future.
Right, Klisman, last word to you on the energy challenges that Europe faces.
They're bad, essentially, to say the least. I think what the US can do is supply LNG to Europe, which will ease energy inflation in Europe and also secure energy for the long run. Phasing out Russian energy is a good idea. They should already had a backup plan when the times were good, because they never knew what the geopolitical picture would turn out to be. Being over-reliant is something that the Chinese aren't, for example. Only 20% of their energy comes from any one source, so I think they should have some sort of similar structure in the EU. And hopefully this will ease energy tensions and also reduce inflation and reduce the cost of living for the average European family.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.